Today, April 26, 2022, I, Maya Hill, the interviewer, will be interviewing Mr. VP Franklin. The location is over Zoom, and this oral history is for the Black Student Alumni Oral History Project. So VP Franklin, Dr. Franklin, I am so happy that you are joining me today to be interviewed and to share about your experience as a Penn State student during the late 1960s. And so we're just going to jump right into some basic questions, the biography, like where you're from, how you grew up, about your parent life. So can you just tell us where you're from, location, school life, and family life?
Yes, well, Mia, I'm really glad to be able to participate in this oral history project because it will be really important because I'm also donating my papers to Penn State. So this oral history project an interview will be included in the VP Franklin papers that will be in the Penn State archive. Okay, now in terms of the questions, I was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and grew up in North Philadelphia. I attended Catholic schools. My parents, my father is a musician and a federal government worker, and his family was AME, African Methodist Episcopal Church members. My mother, Cecilia Franklin, she was raised Catholic and had a Cape Verdean. Her father was Cape Verdean, and so the Catholics at that time were insisting that the children be raised in the Catholic Church. And so my father had to take classes, and then we were enrolled at Most Precious Blood of Our Lord Parish School in North Philadelphia. It was at like 28th and Diamond in North Philadelphia. And so we went, I have a brother who is 3 years younger than me, and a sister who was 10 years younger than me. And my sister was of course born in 1957, but she passed away in 1995. But my brother still lives in Philadelphia, and I just visited him not that long ago. My parents have passed away. I went through Most Precious Blood of Our Lord Parish School up through grade 8. We called it Blood for short. But yes, I went to Blood. Yes, and then students from Blood were assigned to Bishop Newman High School in South Philadelphia, and I went. So from the ninth grade, I attended Bishop Newman High School in South Philadelphia. It was fine. I didn't have any problems or anything with that, except there was some racism among the priests. The school was predominantly Italian and Italian American, and I think it was only maybe one other school that sent their males. It was a male school, all boys, sent their students. I think it was one other St. Charles Borromeo, some other school where there are another group of Black students would enroll at. So we're very few Black students at Bishop Newman at that time. And it was fine. I had problems, but there was racism and practiced by the priests, which was really strange to me and my classmates. There was in the homeroom, there was a priest, and he was evidently I think he was from the Netherlands or somewhere, and he was the homeroom teacher, my homeroom teacher, and he would make statements in class. And thank goodness for his thick accent, because what he was saying was racist. He was making racist statements in class and stuff. And I just said, oh, I didn't pay any attention. But what was funny or interesting was that he would never respond to me. I was the only Black person in the class. And I would raise my hand for something and he would ignore it. He would not call on me, or if I had to go to anything, he would never call on me. And then there were times when he would go around the class asking everyone information about what they were doing, or some question he was asking, and he was asking all the students in the class, and he would skip me each time he would do this. So I thought that's really terrible that he that he would do this. But the other students, they thought that was great. They said, "Oh wow, he doesn't call on you. You got it good. You got it going good." Yeah. But he was just racist, and that was why he was not calling on me and stuff. So that was the ninth grade. I did well there, but my father wanted me to go to Central High School, and so he insisted that I take the test and go to Central High School, which is, of course, at Ogonson, Alumni in Philadelphia. And so I was 224, Central High School 224 became my class. I entered there in the 10th grade and graduated in 1965. So I was in the, so it's 224, class of 224, graduated in 1965. Central was different in that, whereas Bishop Newman was predominantly Italian at that time, Central was predominantly Jewish. And they referred to Central, some people referred to Central as the synagogue on the hill, because it's way up on a hill in Philadelphia. And there was so many Jewish, so the best day to go to school was on a Jewish holiday, because there wouldn't be any students. Most of the teachers would be gone. You just roam around the school all day. That was the best day. That was the best day to go when there was Jewish holiday, because there was, I would say, 60, 70% of the students were Jewish at Central High School when I was attending there. And so I attended there. It was a very, very, it was college prep. Everything was college prep at Central, because all students go on to college and stuff. And what was interesting was that because the entire school was college prep, everything was done on the basis of your last name, the spelling of all your, everything was, there were no different classes or different courses of study. Everybody was, so you went around with people, classes and stuff with people who were D, E, F, and so you went through with those people, because everything was for your year. Everything was, everybody was in the same program. It was college prep. They prepared us for the PSAT test. They prepared us for the SAT test. And they prepared us for applying to college, and all of that. And so that was, so while I was there, I did not do very much while I was in high school. One reason was because it was far away. In North Philadelphia, Central High School was in Ogonson. I had to take 2 or 3 means of transportation to get there. So that, so it was kind of hard getting back and forth. The other reason I didn't engage in very many extracurricular activities, at Central, was because I really had to be at home to be there when my sister, who was 10 years younger, would come home from school, and my parents were working. And so I would have to be there to take care of my sister and my brother. And so I was not, and so that became a real challenge. When I'm filling out the college application, they say, "Oh, what activities did you engage in?" And I said, "Ooh, what am I going to do?" And so,
babysitting.
Pardon me?
You could have wrote babysitting my brother and sister.
Right. But what I did was, there was another student that was in the same situation, and his name was Dyson. So this is Franklin Dyson. Like you went around with the same person who, if their last name is close to yours, spelling. And so he said, "Well, maybe we can join the World Affairs Club. They just meet like once a month or every time, and and so we could say that we belong to that, and we can go in there. I said, oh, okay, let's do that. So we joined the World Affairs Club a couple times. We went a couple meetings and stuff, so that I have something to write on the college application that as an extracurricular activity.
Yeah. So before we jump to your college experience and getting to know how you picked and selected Penn State, how important was education to your family? You talked about like your father transferring you to Central and, you going to Catholic schools and some different experiences that you had in those school systems. So how important was education to your family? And then furthering your education and going to college, how important was that?
Well, that was, it was expected that you would go to college. I have college graduates in my family. My grandmother, my grandfather were college graduates, and my mother was a professional. Her post-high school education was as a beautician. She was a licensed beautician. And then she also became a practical nurse, but she went to school after high school to get a license as a licensed beautician. So that was so they were all, so this was post-high school education. My father graduated from high school, but he was a musician. And so he had all kind of musical training. And when I was growing up, he had a combo that played around in clubs in the Philadelphia area, in New Jersey, et cetera. And so, and then I had his sister, who was my aunt, Eloise Owen Struthers. She was an opera singer, a lyric opera singer in Philadelphia, and had all this additional training as an opera singer and stuff. And so it was sort of like expected that we would go to college. It was they all had post-secondary training, professional training, et cetera. And so, college seemed natural for us. It wasn't like a question. And for me or for my family, because they all valued education and all were, really pretty well educated.
Yeah. So getting to your senior year, you say you're filling out these college applications. Can you share what colleges you applied to and how you narrowed it down to Penn State? And how did you even hear about Penn State? Like, let's start there. How did you hear about Penn State?
Right. When I was applying, you have to keep in mind that the students at Central applied to all these schools, and they all got in. They all got these scholarships, and they won all these things because they were, Central at that time was one of the highest ranked high schools in the country. It would be like on merit scholars. They would like come in one or two, each year and stuff. And so they were going to Harvard and Yale and University of Pennsylvania and all these places. And because it was so academically rigorous, I did well. I wasn't in the top tier of the school because those were the people that got 800 in the SAT and were going to Harvard and going to Yale and all of that. So I was in the second group. I had a good grade point average and all of that, but I wasn't in the top because the top were these really great students, and so when I was trying to think about college, I have a cousin who's the same age. She was at Germantown High School. And so we talked about where we would go and stuff. And both of us, we applied to Howard University in Washington, D.C., applied there. I was contacted by Lafayette University and asked to apply there. And that was the result of me taking a test, a preliminary PSAT, and they got my name and they contacted me. And I said, they sent me this information and, they had to apply there. I don't think I applied there really, but they sent me all of this information and stuff. And Penn State was possible for me because I could commute and work. And work to pay for my education and stuff. And so I applied to Penn State because it was it was a good school. A lot of people in the central, my colleagues, they were all applying to Penn State, and all of them going to Penn State, yeah, where you go to Penn State. But I was at the Ogons campus in Abington, Pennsylvania, my freshman year. And the reason was because I had to work. So I always worked when I was in undergraduate school. So I worked it's one of those, I worked my way through college kinds of situations, because my freshman year, after I worked, for example, in the summer of 1965, I was a teacher's assistant in the new Head Start programs, which started that summer. Head Start, for the kindergarten children. And I applied and worked at a school in my neighborhood as a teacher's assistant. And that money that I earned as a teaching assistant in the Head Start program at William Dick School in the summer of 1965, I then used to pay my college expense, tuition and that kind of thing. And then once I started teaching, once I started in Abington, rather, I was assistant teacher in the Head Start, but once I started at Abington at the Ogons campus, I worked various jobs and stuff in factories. And, that year I was a dishwasher, so I worked while I was at Ogons campus as well. And so the commuting was hard because I didn't have a car. I didn't have a car. And so I didn't have any help learning to drive or any of that and stuff. And that was a big controversy for me. But in any case, I did not have a car. So I took public transportation all the way out to Abington and then back to Philadelphia for these various jobs that I would have that first year. But I was but that first year at Ogons was really very interesting because I became involved in things, because I said I was not going to do what I did in high school. In high school, I did nothing. I had nothing. I participated didn't participate in anything. And so I said, I am going to turn over a new leaf now that I'm in college, and I'm going to be involved in as much stuff as I can get involved in. And so at Ogons, I was a member of the CORE chapter, Congress of Racial Equality chapter, that was at Ogons campus in 1965, 1966. And our project at that time was working with the CORE in Philadelphia, the Congress of Racial Equality branch of Philadelphia, and dealing with tenant rights and stuff. It was more tenant rights that they were interested in, helping people deal with terrible landlords and trying to help people in the housing projects to get improvements in their homes and stuff. So this is what CORE in Philadelphia was engaged in, and the CORE chapter at Ogons worked with the CORE chapter in Philadelphia. And so that was one of my activities. One of my failed activities at Ogons was ROTC. The ROTC, that was the first year, I think this was the first year that Penn State made ROTC optional, because it was required before then. All males had to belong. For example, at Howard, had I gone to Howard, it still was a requirement at Howard, and that you would have had to. But at Penn State, they made it voluntary. And so what happened was that when you had the freshman orientation, this was a different situation for the ROTC, because they had to convince the students to join, because it was no longer a requirement and stuff. And so when we were in freshman orientation in the main hall, there and stuff, they said, they made an announcement. They said, okay, all of the women leave the building, all of the males stay. And we said, well, what the hell, what is this? So we stand there. And so these Army officers came up and told us, now that it's voluntary, we have to recruit you to ROTC. But since it was required all along, most males that came to Ogon's campus were in ROTC, unless they were some kind of sissy or something like that, if they hear they not in ROTC, something wrong with them. So we ran over and signed up for ROTC. And so I signed up, I said, I'm definitely going to sign up for this, And so, but I was indisputably the worst recruit on campus that year, that fall, because it was just the fall quarter, because Penn State was on quarters at that time. And it was the fall quarters, and I was officially labeled the worst recruit that they had. Whatever things that I was supposed to be doing, I was not doing right. And they would try to show me how to shoot the rifle right and how to march and bow face. And I don't like this and stuff. And I didn't like, and the problem that I had with it was that I did not necessarily like the people in the military who were giving us all these orders. And so I said, do this, all right, so I just said, no, I'm not. And so they tried to whip me into shape and they could not do it. But, so at the end of that quarter, they brought me into the military office and they said, well, we're not going to fail you because you owe us, because you got demerits, and I had like 1 million demerits, the boots not shine, medals not shine, I had like 1 million demerits. They said, well, we're not going to flunk you. We're going to give you a C or a D or something like that. They said they want to give you this C or D. And I told him, I said, well, I got A's in all of my other classes. And so this C or D that you gave me kept me off the D's list. So goodbye, ROTC. So I said, I'm not taking it. They said they were going to give me a break by giving me a C or a D. And I said, I said, this is the end. I'm not going to, I'm going, you kept me off the Dean's list, forget it, And in the subsequent quarters, I was got on the Dean. I was on the Dean's list and stuff. But that first quarter with the ROTC kept me off and stuff. So that was my freshman year.
So can you share your major? Like what field?
I was a history major. I was a history major.
Yeah, we're one in
from the beginning, almost from the beginning. And you have to keep in mind that history majors were thought that this would be preparation in case you want to go to law school and stuff. And so that that was very clear. That being a history major, you can then apply and go to law school and become a lawyer. And that was an option that I thought that I would have. And so I became a history major and eventually joined the history honors program. And that was really wonderful experience in the honors program in history, beginning at Ogon's and then continuing once I got to the main campus. Okay. And so, that I got to the main campus for my sophomore year. And I lived in 1966, 67 for my sophomore year. So I'm at the campus, at main campus, my sophomore year. And I did not like living in the dorms. They assigned a person to be your dorm mate at that time. You didn't have any control over that. They assigned it. And I was assigned to this person who was a farmer who had been in that dorm on that floor, I think it was Pollock Hall, on that floor for several years. So he knew everybody. Mm-hmm. And so everybody would show up in his room, which was also my room. And I said, this is not working out. And so that was a problem. But then I got a friend of mine who had gone to elementary school with, who was also at Penn State. who I go on the blood with, who was at Penn State. And he became my roommate for the rest of that sophomore year, because you were required to live in the dorms at least a year. So that was my year of living in the dorms. And so,
so when go ahead.
And I was working, and I was working in the library. So I had various jobs in Pate Library, and I worked on. And then in the summer, I would have summer jobs in factories, and I polished jewelry, and I was worked in a sweater factory, and I worked in on Sears in the Roebuck or out on Roosevelt Boulevard. I would work 20 hours. Normally I would work 20 hours a week. And that would that would support me, pay my rent, and all of that, because I was able to get a state scholarship my second year. I wasn't able to get for the tuition that would cover the tuition. So I had a tuition scholarship my second year and followed all the way through, because of my grade point average, because I was doing very well. And so the tuition was taken care of, but I had all of my other expenses I had to pay for myself, including the rent. And so I worked, my sophomore year. Then, and during the summers. And then in my junior year, I worked in the library and all of that. And, but then I decided to go in the study abroad program, Penn State study abroad program. And so that 67, 68 is the school year, okay? And so in the fall and in the winter, I think you had to take, I was admitted into the study abroad program after there was some problems with some people thought that it would be inappropriate or something for me to be in the program or something like that. I said, oh no, why? Or, what is the problem? I will challenge this. And so they said, okay, no, let it go. Because I was the only Black person in the program, in the study abroad program. I think that in all of wherever they went, I think some went to London, England, some went to Germany, some went to Italy, I think, and I was in Spain. I think some went to France, but I was in Spain because I had studied Spanish. I had Latin first when I was at Bishop Newman and at my first year at Central. So I had 2 years of Latin. But my junior year, I shifted to Spanish. So I'd had Spanish. And so when I came to Penn State, I placed out of this foreign language requirement because I took the test, the Spanish test, and I passed this. I wasn't required to take any foreign language courses. But because I was going to Salamanca, they required that you take these conversation courses and advanced Spanish courses, which I did. I took these advanced Spanish courses. Didn't help me, but took the Spanish courses that they gave. And the reason why they did not help was because the professors who were teaching at Penn State were from South America. I think one was the one I had right before in the conversation class was from Peru. And he was teaching there. That was the conversation class. When we get to Salamanca, and I live with a family, Spanish family, that's Spanish, but South American Spanish. They said, oh no, you got to learn Castellano, muy católico. And so they wiped away all that Spanish and said, you have to learn Castilian, because that's what we speak here. And so the Spanish that I didn't help at all. It was because we had to learn the Castilian. And so we got there in like February, and I ended up staying until July. So we're talking about 1968, okay, and that, of course, was a volatile year. Right. So I'm in Spain, when Lyndon Johnson announces that he's not going to run for re-election. That was the first shock that we heard and said, "Well, that was what? He's not running. Oh, this is great." So, of course, the next shock, of course, was the assassination of Martin Luther King while we were there. And that there was an outpouring of the people in Spain, even though it's a dictatorship under Francisco Franco, they were very much taken aback by the assassination, and they were very kind to me, and in my bereavement, in the mourning and stuff that occurred. So that was positive.
I want to ask about when you got to main campus. I kind of just want to go back a little bit. So when you left the Ogans campus and you transferred to the main campus, what was that experience like? Again, you shared that you went to school and you were probably the only African-American student in a lot of your classes. So how did that, in coming to Penn State, was that an easy adjustment, or did you find yourself still faced with a lot of challenges? And just kind of briefly, you said that there was possibly some challenges that you were going to face in going to the study abroad. I don't know if it was due to race or whatever it could have been due to, but can you talk about kind of like your experience in coming to Penn State, maybe your experience with the faculty at the time, just adjusting to the community, like you said, the dorm room life. What was it like just being in, a majority or a sea of white students, and it was almost like less than 1% of African-American students? I think it was like 25,000 students versus 250 students, African-American students on campus at the time. And that, we know
there were less than that when I arrived.
Probably when you arrived, this was probably 1969, once they did the 10.
Yeah, right. 69, there were about 250. But when I got there, at least they said it was only like 75 or 80 or something. Because remember, we're talking about 66 is when I arrived there. And one thing, I didn't have as much problems adjusting because I had gone to predominantly white schools. And so I didn't have, I had, Central, Bishop Newman. I mean, they were all predominantly white schools. And so Penn State wasn't different. It was no different. There were also people from Central who were there at Penn State. And so I had people that were, just like I mentioned, my person that was my roommate, who I go to elementary school with, et cetera. And so we were at Penn State. So there were a lot of people at Penn State that from Central or from Philadelphia that I knew. So it wasn't difficult at all to make that kind of transition for me, because of where, the schools I had attended before. Penn State wasn't different than my other experiences. The one thing that was interesting when I got to Penn State was the Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, was on campus, and I joined SDS. I was a member of the Student Democrat for a Democratic Society, and they were engaged in all kind of march protests and anti-war activities and stuff like that. And so I participated in SDS, but then there's the break because I went away. So that was the break. So it was like the sophomore and in fall of my junior year that I was involved with SDS, and then I left and went to Spain, and then do not come back until the fall of '68. So that was the difference. In terms of the professors and the courses and stuff, I enjoyed the professors. The professors I had at Ogans were very, very good, and I really liked them. That were the history classes and stuff. The courses I took extra courses. I always, if I heard a professor was really good, I took his course. And stuff, because I really wanted to get the most out of my what Penn State had to offer, and that turned out to be really great. Because Penn State was large, and so it had the same kind. If you searched it out, you could have as good an education as someone in an Ivy League, a small Ivy League school like Yale or Williams or Amherst or one of those schools and stuff. So that, because I just took advantage of what Penn State had to offer. Mm-hmm. And so if somebody was considered, you know, the historians were all very, very good. And so I took all kinds of courses and stuff with the history courses and did well. I didn't have any problems and stuff with the courses, with the professors. I was in the honors program, and took those courses, and that really prepared me very well for going, for post college, post Penn State activities at Harvard and stuff. And so I just took advantage of whatever, was going on, whatever Penn State had to offer, I took advantage of it. Mm-hmm. It was really interesting. I remember there was this art historian that he was very, very, very famous art historian and stuff. And I said, I'm gonna take that art history course. And I took the art history course. And he was a stickler in terms of the exams and stuff. And, and the students writing and, whether or not they would be able to describe it, because it was on the Gothic cathedral. And you had to be able to describe the Gothic cathedral, the entire facade of the Gothic cathedral, by the end of the class, and all this stuff. And so I said, oh, this is interesting. So I took the course and stuff. And so he told us, so at the final exam, the professor said, there's one person that described the Gothic cathedral facade exactly like I said it should be described, and was perfect. And I'm going to read this answer to this exam so that you can see that it can be done in so many words and so many paragraphs. You can describe the entire facade of a Gothic cathedral. And he started reading my paper. Mm. And so I was, that's that nice. He liked what I wrote. At the end of the class, he said, you should think about becoming an art historian. You do this really well. I said, no, I'm a history major and I'm going to Harvard. And so, so that's all right, though. It better. And so that's what I'm saying, that I took advantage of the best people. I think there was, George Bernard, I think there was an English professor that was a scholar, George Bernard Shaw, and I took his classes, stuff. So I took things, and then I was in the honors program in history and stuff. And so I took full advantage of what they had to offer. And so it wasn't so, there were few Black people, and the fraternity sort of controlled social life for Black students and the fraternities. And I was asked if I wanted to join the Alphas that was on campus, but I was so involved in so many other things. I said, oh no, I'm too busy. I'm doing too many things. I don't have time to be, to do that, because I was going abroad and all, and so that was, so I didn't have that kind of adjustment, at Penn State. I mean, there were a few Black students, but keep in mind, that's where I had from Bishop Newman, from Central, to Penn State was not that difference. And I didn't run across discrimination, a lot of discrimination at Penn State or anything that caused me problems or something like that incident I didn't encounter anything like that incident at Bishop Newman. That was really unfortunate. I did not experience that. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, let's transition over to student activism. I want to hear about your time as a student activist on campus. I mean, I don't know if you went in believing that you were going to become a student activist, but you kind of created a course for yourself to become a student activist for students, housing, like downtown housing. And you did mention that you were part of SDS. And so just kind of mentioning how you got involved in student activism. And I guess I'm believing this would have started fall of 68 into
No, I was in SDS earlier.
early.
I was in SDS and I participated in various, like they had the marches in New York City, they had the war marches, in Washington and DC. And I would go to those marches and stuff and participate in things like that SDS was involved in. And then I was gone, in Spain from like February to August or July of 68. Okay. So now I'm coming back to the fall of 68. And my roommates was the friend of mine who had been my roommate in the dorm, and then two others, people, colleagues, friends of mine. We got an apartment. You have to keep in mind, this is the boom, and the housing is precious, and people are doubling up and tripling up and stuff. And so we had this small apartment, relatively small apartment with these bunk beds, 2 sets of bunk beds for 4 people, in there trying for this apartment that was owned by Dr. Sun, who was a professor in the School of Engineering. And so who really became like a slum landlord and stuff, and he was taking advantage of the students by charging these high rents. And so there were 4 of us, and but the rent was still very high. And so we said that we're going to protest. We wanted him to lower the rent and all that. He refused, and so we said that we were going to go around and have all the other people in his apartments around in-state college to hold back their rent and have a rent strike, and until he lowers the rent or improves the conditions in some of these buildings and stuff that the students were living in. Because they were, because you had to come out, there's 4 of us in one apartment, okay? and that was because it was, it was expensive, and so we said, we're going to organize this rent strike against Dr. Sun. And because we had a lease for the whole year, and we want to pay all. You say, no, this is okay. We don't want to do this and stuff. And so we organized this rent strike. Everybody was in favor of it. We got a daily collegiate, and we were on the forefront of Old Main, and we would have rallies, the Dr. Sun rent strike. We would compete who was going to hold the microphone, because it was four of us, organizing this stuff. So ultimately, what Dr. Sun decided to do was let us go. He said, okay, you don't have to worry about your lease. You can leave. And so that for the winter and spring quarters, that I found a little place downtown in State College, that I 1-room, studio kind of place, that my friends who had took advantage of the new housing that was opened up downtown and stuff. They were living high on, they had these really nice apartments and stuff. And they would say that, oh, let's go visit him on Tobacco Road, see how the other half lives. They were there, so when I was paying, I'm paying everything myself. The only time I got any support from my family was when I was in Spain, when I couldn't work. So they provided me some funds and stuff to help me while I was in Spain, because no students could work in Spain at that time. If you were a university student, you could not work in Francisco Franco, Spain. And that was the year of the protests. Salamanca, the students were on strike when we got there. There were protests in Madrid, et cetera. But students did not work. I could not work. And that was the time when my parents decided that they would help me while I'm out of the country. And so that to live. And so that's it. But when I came back, I was back at the T library, working in the library 20 hours, a week. And so I was always working there and stuff. And so that was the fall Now we get to the winter, and you had the student protests, the demands for more Black students, demands for Black faculty, demands for Black studies. You had the Douglas Association involved. I was part of Douglas. I went, when I was up in the archives last week, he said, "Is this you, Mr. Franklin?" He said, "Yeah, you all over the archives." Because I was, as I said, I was part of the demonstrations that in Old Main to try to bring about these changes, increase the number of Black students, increase in the faculty, because I had no Black professors. So I had Black teachers at Central, but I did not have them at Penn State. And so that was a demand. That was one of the demands of the Douglas Association and all of this and stuff. And so we got, and so I participated in all those demonstrations and stuff as part of the student activism in the winter quarter. And as I showed you, that was February, the takeover at Old Main, and I was in Old Main and part of those protests as well. So that was the winter quarter. Then the spring quarter, as you know, they had the Black Arts Festival. And they had, when I was up at Penn State, the archivist, he took out the brochures and the articles on the Black Arts Festival in '68, and so I was fully involved in that. I'm working and but I'm already accepted at various schools. I was applied to Berkeley, Chicago, Harvard, and I was accepted at all. And the first school I was accepted at was Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley. My father hit the roof. "No, you're not going there. That's radical." They told me you're not going there. I said, "Oh, and stuff." But then I was accepted at University of Chicago to study with John Hope Franklin, Black professor John Hope Franklin. So I was going. He's a leading scholar and stuff. So I was accepted there, and I was accepted. And what I did was I decided to apply at Harvard for the Master's of Arts in Teaching program, which would allow me to teach, to go, to teach in public schools, and get my master's, but at the same time get certification to teach. And I say, do I want to go through 4 more years of school? I don't think I want to go for 4 more years. But I was accepted, and I was given a fellowship. I had a full fellowship from the Ford Foundation. I think this was the first year they gave out these doctoral fellowships. And because I remember I had to go to New York to the Ford Foundation building for the interview, and all of that. And I did, that was nice and stuff. And then they called me in the morning to say, "Yes, you got one of these Ford fellowships. So you can go to any school for the next 4 years. 5 years, we will pay you have a fellowship for that." And I said, do I want to do that? But I had, and I was going, and I told them that I was going to Chicago. And because I had the fellowship, I had to tell them where I was going, and that was the PhD, in history department at the University of Chicago. But then I said, then I got a scholarship to go to Harvard. And so I said, okay, I'll just go to Harvard and hang out in Harvard Square and, with all of the hippies and all of that and do that. Then I can teach and I can go back to my community, go back, the people are riding and stuff, and they opened up these spaces for us at these colleges. And so I'm going to go get my teaching certificate and go back and teach and stuff, and the people at the Ford Foundation were really upset with me because I didn't tell them that I was not taking the fellowship, that I changed my mind. Because they said, "We're going to give that to somebody else." I said, "Yeah, but so that was terrible." But I just didn't decide until the last minute that I was going to, do this master's at Harvard. But in any case, the Black Arts Festival. So I was, so that spring quarter, I was in the play, Days of Absence, that we put on. There was the dance routine, a big dance and stuff that we had. I participated in that, you know, and I was the very singing, you know, organizing the artists coming to campus and all that. So I participated in all of that as well. While I was supposed to be doing my senior thesis in the honors program. And so I'm accepted at Harvard. I'm working on the Black Arts Festival. Do I have time to finish my senior honors thesis? You know, and stuff. And I said, you know, and I want to do it on African American history, and there's nothing in the library on African American history and stuff. You know, there's nothing here. You know, I can't do this and stuff, you know, and stuff. I said, well, I don't know what, maybe I said, wait a minute, I've been working on this in this program for 4 years. I mean, like 4 years with all this courses and all this. I said, I should get my honors. And so I waited to like the last minute and found that, and I had to do it on something. I had to do it on something with primary sources. I had to find some primary sources and stuff. Remember, there's nothing on African Americans because this is 68, 60, this is 69, this is 69. So I ended up finding these accounts of Europeans visiting the west coast of Africa in the 15th century and the 14th century and all of that. And some of them were, and I took French as well because I thought I'd need French for my PhD. You need 2 languages, you know, 2 free words. So I had taken French. And so I could read the French but most of them were in English. These travelers, these European travelers, describing what they saw and the people they encountered on it. And so that became my thesis. I used the account and I said, oh yeah, these are the primary sources, you know, and stuff. So keep in mind, I'm doing all these things. And so Ira Brown was at the head of the honors program at that time. And he called me in and he said, you know, this is not your finest work. He said, this thesis, you know, he said, I'm gonna give you a B for this. He said, but you know, I said, yeah, well, yeah. You're senioritis.
Yeah, senioritis.
Bad senioritis, and so, but I managed to get it. And what was really sad was that Ira Brown thought it was him. And so he said, I was the one person that gave him a B. You know, he went to Harvard afterwards, became a historian and all this and stuff, and I gave him a B. I said, no, Professor Brown, it was me. Yeah. I had got senioritis and I was the one that did this thesis at the last minute and stuff. So I left, graduated in, I guess it was in June of 69. And then went to Harvard Newton summer program. And that's where you get, it's like your student teaching, that's kind of student teaching where you're working with master teachers. And it was in Newton, Connecticut, Newton, Massachusetts school system. And you had us, so I was there and living in the graduate dorms at Harvard. And then the rest, and then in that year, and then once the fall started, there were all these protests at Harvard because this was a student activism was going on and stuff, and they were involved in all of these protests and stuff. And they would have the Black students would have all these meetings, and they would talk, you know. And then when they, you know, just talking, you know, and then when they decided to do something, they did it on the spur of the moment, and they wouldn't tell anybody. Some of them actually got arrested, you know, because they tried to block a construction site on campus because there were no people of color as part of the construction crew. And so some of the Harvard students blocked the trucks coming in and out of the construction site, and then they were arrested. And so this was a very bad situation that we didn't know about. I mean, I'm going to all of the meetings, and then we find out that they got arrested, you know, and stuff. They didn't tell you and stuff. So it was, you know, so that was on them. They decided, and I had And so I took the education courses in order to be certified to teach. And while I was in the spring semester, one of the teachers from Harvard, from the Harvard Newton Summer Program, said that they were starting a program, a work study program at Rindge Technical High School in Cambridge. Cambridge Higher Latin and Rindge Tech faced each other on a mall right on the other side of Harvard's campus. Okay, and so it was right there. I wouldn't have to go anywhere. I would just go across the street to Rindge Tech, and and these same people were, the same teacher was also involved in the Upward Bound program in Chelsea, Massachusetts. And she said, oh, well, we would like you to work, if you want to work during the summer, you can work in our Upward Bound program in the summer. And if you want to work on this teach in this work study program at Rindge Tech, you could do that and stuff. I said, okay, all right. It's a new program that they were putting together. And and so it was just that spring semester. And and then in the summer, then I was at Merrimack College for the Upward Bound program. Okay, so but that teaching at Rindge Tech, I was teaching English, not history, not social studies. I was teaching English because that's what they needed. They needed somebody to teach English in this new work study program. And so I taught English, to these students that were working half a day, they went to school in the morning and worked half a day. And then and it was all right. What it turned out was that this was a program that they were instituting for students who they were pushing out of the regular classes. So we found this out. I found this out later, that students that had trouble in the regular classes, and they created this work study program for these students so that they can get a job and they're not in class with the rest of the people and causing trouble as far as they were concerned and all of this. But I was teaching English, and it was mostly Black students in this work study program, even though Rindge Tech was predominantly white school. But I'm just saying, in this work study program of students who had been pushed out, they were in this program. And the chairman of the English department, when I first started the program, the chairman of the English department came to me and told me that I had to watch out for this one student. This one student that they pushed out, but is in this work study program. This student was really terrible because he almost killed the student, outside the classroom, outside the building or something like that. And so you have to watch out for him and stuff. And I said, okay, and stuff. So I had this student, and this student, he seemed to be all right with me. He did all his work. He showed up. He seemed to be kind, and all that stuff. And that chairman of the English department asked me to stay for a full-time job teaching English at Virginia Tech. I said, no, I'm going back to Philadelphia to teach in my neighborhood school, social studies, which is my area. But I'm going back. But so this student, he was nice, he was kind, he helped, helpful, he did all his assignments and stuff. And, I said, this is really strange that he told me this, So I asked him, I said, well, the chairman of the department said that you were a terrible student, that you tried to kill another student and everything. And he was very disturbed about that. And I don't understand, because you seem to be fine, student, and stuff. He told me. So he said to me, Mr. Franklin, if you had heard what that white boy said about Black people, you would have tried to kill him too. And so that was the incident. That's how he got labeled. Yeah. That's how I found that out. But I want to make a really important point here about Penn State going to Harvard, okay? Because when I got to the MAT program, there was one other student that was from Penn State, and he was in engineering. Most of the students, he was my roommate, you know, he was from Penn State. He was, you know, going in a PhD program or something, but he was from Penn State. Most of the people that were in the program were from the Ivy League schools. They were from Williams and Wellesley and Amherst and, and then the, Yale, and, those kind of, and they wanted to get their teacher certification as well to teach and all this, but their undergraduates were these very elite colleges and universities and stuff that they were in class. But because I had taken advantage of what Penn State had to offer, I had studied abroad. They had studied abroad. Oh, I studied abroad. They wrote math, they wrote a senior thesis. Oh, I wrote a senior thesis. Oh, they had to take these languages. I had French and Spanish. I taught and I found that, and that's when I knew that my Penn State education was excellent. And one of my closest friends in that MAT program at Harvard was from Wellesley. Francine Roseanne Wilson, Francine Roseanne at the time, she was from Wellesley. And we were both social studies, getting our degree and stuff. And she was from Wellesley. And so I had compared, we compared, this was my one of my best friends there in the MAT program, and who's still a close friend of mine. Francine Roseanne, she teaches now at USC. I think she may be retired, but she's at USC. She eventually got her PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. But she was a good friend of mine. And so there I could compare, what went on at Wellesley and what went on at Penn State. So this is where I actually know that my Penn State education was really top notch. And, and I am thankful for it and stuff. Now I want to say something about Harvard. I didn't have problems I had problems in one course at Harvard, but you have to keep in mind, this is 1970, and you had the Kent State shooting. And so the schools closed early. I don't know whether you knew about that, but the schools, because of the protests on the campus where they shot the students at Kent State, and it was all this turmoil on all these campuses and stuff because he bombed Cambodia, Nixon had bombed Cambodia and the school. And so they said, rather than we just go shut down, the schools and stuff in early that spring semester of 70. And I had, I took my course and stuff, and I had been working on my thesis, and I was working on my senior thesis, my master's thesis at Harvard with a new professor who had just arrived there. Now, I had taken courses in the fall in the Afro-American Studies program that was starting at Harvard. And I had taken this course on slavery that was excellent. Ephraim Isaac, he was an Ethiopian Jew who was teaching the course, spoke 14 languages, and was brilliant and stuff. And I took that course with him. The spring on slavery, on the history of slavery in the ancient world. And then in the spring, I took other courses and stuff, but I decided that I was going to do my master's thesis on slavery, on the 8 slaveries, some point that I want to do something. So what I found was, I found a guidebook written in Spanish that was, now keep in mind, I'm fluent in Spanish at this time, and so I didn't have any problem with that, because we all became fluent because we didn't speak any English while we were in Spain. So I had found this guidebook that was written for Jesuits working with enslaved Africans as they were coming into Cartagena, Nueva Granada, Spain, in the 17th century. Okay, and it was a guidebook, and it was famous because this was the teacher of St. Peter Claver. St. Peter Claver, as you may know, but St. Peter Claver was the patron saint of Blacks, of Africans, of Black people. He worked with the enslaved workers, slave people who came to Cartagena, and baptized them and helped them and all that. And in most cities, most large cities, there is a St. Peter Claver parish, and it's usually a Black Catholic parish. So there was a St. Peter Claver parish in Philadelphia. And we worked, and I think that was the other school that went to Bishop Newman. Now that I think about it, that's where the other Black students that were going to Bishop Newman came from. They came from St. Peter Claver. So I knew about St. Peter Claver, and this was the guides for priests working with enslaved Africans and stuff that was produced to try to help them to carry out that mission and stuff. And so, but it was 17th century Spanish. It was about like 1627 or something. It was published. But I could read it and stuff. And so it was hard, but I could read it. And so I translated it. And all of the accounts about the Jesuits and St. Peter Claver and Alonso de Sandoval, who wrote this guide for priests and stuff, they all said that this was an anti-slavery text. That this was something that, opposed slavery. This is where the Jesuits are opposing slavery, and all of this. And so, and all of the major books on slavery in South America, under the Spanish, during the 16th, 17th, 18th century, they all said that this book, and that written by Alonso de Sandoval, was an anti-slavery work. So I'm reading it, and I'm like, this is not anti-slavery book. This is like a justification of slavery. They should be enslaved because they children of Ham. So that's why they should be enslaved. And keep in mind they probably were slaves already in Africa. So all you doing is going from slavery in Africa to a tribal king to be a slave of a Christian in the New World. And so they would be better off because now they would be, but it was not anti-slavery at all. And I said, and all of these books they were saying, and the major scholars wrote this. They said David Bryan Davis was the major scholar, had this, said this was Elijah de Sandoval's book was working with the Ethiopians. It's not an anti-slavery work. I said, it's not. I translate. This is not an anti-slavery work. And the person who had just arrived at Harvard, who had just published a book on slavery in Jamaica, I think it was called A Sociology of Slavery or something like that, was Orlando Patterson. Orlando Patterson, who's still at Harvard now. But he had just arrived, and his area was slavery. So I said, I guess I'll do my master's thesis with him. Since, he does slavery, I taken the slavery courses in the fall. He had just arrived. I think I may have taken his course as well and stuff. And he was going to be my advisor on my master's thesis. And I, wrote up that this was really not an anti-slavery work. And I gave it to him. He said, oh yeah, nobody's doing this kind of stuff anymore. Nobody's concerned about religion anymore and stuff. And I said, but this is wrong. He's like, oh yeah, this is all right. You did this. This is fine. But it's not important and stuff. I said, okay. I don't think he read it, but nonetheless, that was my master's thesis. I did it on the lines of Sandoval, et cetera. And what is really interesting about this is that when I got to Yale, I worked with David Bryan Davis, who was the leading person on slavery and made slavery in the world, Western world, and all of that. Who was one of the people that said that was an anti-slavery work.
Wow.
And so I remember he said, you know, he said, I read your paper because I eventually published some, you know, a translation of this thing to say this is not an anti-slavery work in the Journal of Negro History. And he said, you know, I was going on the basis of what the French had said about this book. He said, I had never read it, but I was going on the basis of what the French scholars had written about the book and stuff. But I had never read it. I said, well, he said, well, you say, yeah, you, yeah, you know, I was wrong and you were right, you know, and stuff. And what was interesting about it, you know, is that he was the chair of my promotion committee at Yale. Wow. And he, you know, I mean, I remember I'm denouncing him in the article I showed, you were wrong. David Davis, you know, this is not an anti-slavery work. You know? And he was the chair of my promotion committee at Yale, and he was fine. He said, thank you, I learned this is, you know, all of this and stuff. And I was promoted at Yale and stuff. So that was it. So I think that is the Penn State part thing that you would be interested in, is that as I went to these other places, Harvard and then eventually the University of Chicago, et cetera, you know, I didn't have any problems, and my experience was not necessarily that positive at Harvard, you know, with Orlando Patterson. Thing told me that nobody was doing this kind of stuff on slavery anymore. We did the stuff on religion before. We don't have to do that. You know, that's what he told me. And so, you know, and as you know, and the other people were all negative at Harvard. They were Nathan Glazer, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, you know, the Moynihan Report, you know, it's, you know, Black families are matriarchal and you know, and that's who we're teaching at in the Graduate School of Education at the time, you know, and stuff. And so I didn't like it. And
that's a different and an interesting perspective. But I do, in our last like just few minutes, I kind of want to jump over to lifetime memories and legacy. As you have already mentioned and shared your story, your transition from Penn State, and then, you know, going to some top schools and then doing well. And I kind of want to highlight some other things that you have done following your time at Penn State. And now you serve as Professor Emeritus of History at University of California, Riverside. And you also
distinguished professor.
Okay, excuse me, distinguished professor. I thank you for correcting.
It's a title.
Oh yeah, okay. Distinguished professor. Excuse me. Thank you for correcting me on that. I want to make sure I get your credentials correct. And then almost 2 weeks ago, April 13th, you were honored by the College of Liberal Arts for the annual Humanitarians Award. And you were the alumni nominated for, I guess it was 2022. And you gave a speech, and I got to watch it. They streamed it online, and it was really good. So just anybody want to watch it, they should go check it out at the libraries. And I think in the College of Liberal Arts section. But I kind of wanted to highlight those achievements, and you probably have done so much more. Also, we want to highlight your book, The Young Crusaders. Throw that in there. If for anyone watching that, go check it out. Go read. We want to give some plugs there. And a lot of your work, especially the work that you donated to Penn State, the archive is on reparations, justice, and youth activism. And so I can see just in the work and scope that you have reached in history, your Penn State experience really helped you in your career and all of the other experiences that you had throughout your life. So I do want to ask one final question to you, and it's about your college experience. So if you would summarize your college experience in one phrase, what would it be and why?
One phrase. Yeah. I saw that on your outline there. My college experience at Penn State was enlightening and fulfilling. Enlightening and fulfilling. Yeah, that would be my I learned so much, so many new things, and I was able to become filled up, with all this knowledge and stuff that I could take with me for the rest of my career, through the rest of my education, but also in my teaching and et cetera. So that would be the faith. My experience at Penn State was enlightening and fulfilling.
Yeah, that's awesome. Enlightening and fulfilling. We can see because you competed with the Ivy League. So, so you made it, it was nothing for you. It was nothing for
Right.
you. You managed and you pulled through. And I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to be interviewed for this oral history project, as you mentioned, and being a historian yourself, documenting oral histories and building up an archive for future students is necessary so that when they go and try to look at, Penn State, a time period that students 20 years from now will be like, 1968, that was so long ago, or 1960, that was so 65, what? That was so long ago. But they'll have some documentation to go back and look and say, wow, these stories may be similar, or Penn State has evolved. And, even for me in doing this project, I didn't find a lot of information in the archives, and I wanted to make sure, because also I am a history major too. So I kind of wanted to make sure, yeah, exactly. We're like, our stories are kind of similar a little bit, but I wanted to make sure that, this history was being documented. And I mean, there's a lot of students who are on campus who are African-American, and they are having similar or, experiences, whether it be through threats from students. And I think it was either 2021, the end of my senior year, or it was entering into 2022, where students actually recreated 8 demands that they sent to President Eric Barron, and about like campus life, some of the threats that Black Caucus members were receiving, et cetera. So I think this information and this documenting this history is really important, and your story really matters in the building up of this archive. So again, thank you so much for taking the time to be interviewed today. And I know people are going to enjoy your work. And again, we encourage, I'm throwing this out there for anyone who goes to the archives, go check out VP Franklin's work in the Petit Library, and then also his Young Crusaders book when you get the chance. So thank you so much, VP Franklin.
Thank you, Mayor Hill. Thank you for the invitation. And this oral interview will be part of my archive there at Penn State. I'm glad they're willing to accept it.